All right, everybody, welcome to a very special episode here at Theory Underground. This is one between two people I really look up to, Todd McGowan and Chris Cutrone. Two people I look up to so much that they will actually be teaching at Theory Underground this summer. Theory Underground is an ongoing research, publishing, and teaching platform which puts a lot of its content out on YouTube and podcasts for free. But behind the scenes, there are courses. The courses are taught by me or people I want to learn from, professors whose work relates to the kinds of research we're doing at Theory Underground. Todd McGowan and Chris Cutrone are both doing work that directly relates to several of our ongoing research themes. I'll insert something later into the episode that provides more information about those courses. For now, I'll just say that this was not a debate. Instead, it is what we now call a converdiction. Converdictions are contradiction conversations. And whereas debates have sides, one of which is going to win and the other is supposed to, be considered the loser, converdictions don't have any losers unless, of course, you're an ideologue, which is to say, converdictions are geared towards people who have not chosen some side so much as are trying to think for themselves. And if you're trying to think for yourself, then it helps to see people who hold different kinds of positions have a mature conversation where they talk about those differences. Like adults are supposed to.
These are supposed to be ongoing conversations. And the point is, it's a conversation, but it's a contradiction, but it's not a debate because we're not trying to have a winner or loser. We don't want this to be like a sports event, right? And so I think the proper term for it is converdiction. So
Contradiction. Yeah, contradiction. I like that it's not a debate because debates both have a winner and loser. And one of the things I find interesting about debate is they're not invested. You cannot be invested in the position that, like people that are actual debaters, right? They have no investment in the position they're debating. In fact, sometimes they're only assigned it when they get to the debate, right? They know they have the information for both sides, and then they get, you're going to be pro this time, and so I feel like in a way that's a kind of uh, synecdoche for the problem of debate itself, right? Like it's almost like you can choose either side.
well, think about it, like sports is not sports is its own thing insofar as like it's not a form of inquiry. It's not trying to get at the truth, right? And if what we're trying to do is maybe we don't get at the truth in some final sense, of course, but traffic with the truth as uh, maybe we could put it. Um, you don't do that if you're trying to win. Like it's a whole different mindset of like it's rhetoric versus dialectics to me.
Right, right. And I also think I really like the way you put that, and I think that the you're trying to get at because you're also trying to find the internal contradictions of your own position, right? Like it's
Mhm.
not like sports is not about like no team wants to discover its own internal contradictions. Like that's what they're trying to avoid in beating the opponent, right?
With that said, there's a little thing I got to say. Whenever Theory Underground puts an episode that is likely to attract a lot of leftists out, we do a disclaimer. Basically, we have a disproportionate amount of leftists in our membership, but that is not because we are a leftist organization. Theory Underground has ex-activists, ex-academics, and ex-addicts who have all, for better or worse, gotten into underground theory research for their own reasons. But ultimately, it's like burnout of some sort leads to the realization that you want to go deeper and try to understand things. We produce this stuff for workers with earbuds and disposable time who are getting into the life of the mind. That means we do not assume a leftist audience. In fact, the idea that the left is the force for good as opposed to an ideological obfuscation that helps people continue along reproducing today's duopoly is an assumption that is critically suspended. Yep. So that's pretty much that. If you're listening to this and are unsure of what your politics are, I mean, whether you voted for Obama, Trump, Biden, or if you've never voted in your life because you don't feel represented by anyone, or whether you voted for the Green Party or the Libertarians, or, I mean, we don't care. And we don't care if you're religious or not. Pretty much anybody's welcome here as long as they're not going to center their identity as much as the questions, problems, concepts, and thinkers necessary for trying to work with other people towards understanding the current situation. And for many of us, with the goal of hopefully being able to someday have some kind of a positive impact on it. But ultimately, this is a learning space. And so if you're here for it, welcome. And with that, let's get to the contradiction. All right, everybody. Welcome to Theory Underground. I'm your host today. This is the last segment of an all-day epic live stream marathon at Theory Underground. An ELM 2 is the acronym for that. And this is the fourth contradiction of the day, a contradiction conversation. And we're really excited to be joined now by Todd McGowan and Chris Cutrone. How are you two doing?
Good.
Oh, sorry. You said my name first, so I should say first. I'm doing great, David. Nice to see you, and good to see. I've never met Chris before, so it's good.
That's right. Good to meet.
Yeah.
When I first announced that this was going to happen, Rudy, who's in the chat right now, which is crazy because he's in Germany, so it's super late. He was like, I was just Googling Cutrone and McGowan to see if they had ever talked. So you know that the demand's already there. And then today I've had people all day saying that they've wanted to see this conversation happen. And so, you know, as far as my assessment of the theory scene today goes, you two are, I said it in the Substack post actually, and Todd raised a question about it. Like you're kind of like a couple of father figures in the scene, and maybe godfather figures, you know. On the one side, we have, I would just say, the left, like the old left, and the analysis of its, or the, well, we'll let you explain your position in a little bit here, but the platypus affiliated society, and then on the other side, this more Žižekian approach that is, well, as Chris would say, French. It's Frenchified. And so I thought, you know, well, then I guess you're German and he's French, and so I guess it's all about croissants versus brats today. Yeah. So
I'm not German myself, of course. I'm Italian and Irish, and I'm really American.
You are what you eat, man. I'm sure you are what you read even more, right?
Freedom fries. Freedom fries. No, as opposed to the French fries.
Well, I guess I'll just say I met you both on tour. I interviewed you each for the documentary Underground Theory. You're both in the Underground Theory volume. Most people who are in my audience are in some way following both of you. And I think you've both been on other places, but never at the same time. You've been here, you've been at Sublation. There's been all kinds of places that you've both appeared. So finally it's happening. And so for the audience who doesn't know who Todd McGowan and Chris Cutrone is, I'm not going to do this whole thing where I do it, you know, the justice, that introduction. But basically it's Why Theory, the podcast, one of the most important podcasts in the world, in my opinion. I know Todd hates it when we butter his biscuit, but then Chris, the founder of the Platypus Affiliated Society, which is instrumental in organizing educational conversations outside of academia related to Marxism and its failures. So with that, is there anything, Todd, that you would like to add by way of introduction?
No, let's just start. I'm ready to start. Chris can add things. Yeah.
Anything you'd like to add?
No,
there?
that's a good intro.
Cool.
Yeah, that's a good intro.
All right. Well, then in that case, I'll just start it off with a little history lesson. For those who are not aware, before Theory Underground, there was a channel called Theory Plebe, and I used to be some kind of left tuber. I was a Bernie activist, but I always loved Marx, and I was always interested in psychoanalysis and psychology, and I've been studying that stuff for 10 years. And well, theory play, but it got to a certain point where I was like, I don't want to have a persona online. I'm going to stop pretending and I'm not being myself. It's impossible, but also I'm not going to have this theory play persona because I didn't know how to manage it and the expectations that were being put on it, much less the Patreon dynamic with a lot of activist patrons. I didn't like that. By the way, shout out to my 2 new patrons today. Thank you, Matt and Kurt Lantic. Thank you guys. But no, I mean, because I started a new one, but that's because I had to theorize, like, what am I doing? And so I had to start all over again. And Theory Underground was how I was starting all over again. But before it became Theory Underground, it was Theory Plebe. And I was talking to Chris, maybe this was the second out of 3 conversations we had in 2022. And it was called Adorno, Who, How, Why, or something like that. And I think it was like actually on Adorno and Lenin. And like basically like, how is it that you like you're super into Lenin, but you're also into Adorno? And so like that whole conversation is up, everybody. I made it available a few weeks ago. It had been unlisted for a long time. And I made it available because I wanted people to be able to do their homework before this conversation if they were so inspired. But basically, at some point in that conversation, you tore into French theory. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I think the most provocative thing that you said was that you take Lacan about as seriously as you take Proud Boys talking about retaining their semen. And I was like, how can
the left has been swallowed at an intellectual level by all sorts of non-Marxist and anti-Marxist ideas, whether it's Lacanian psychoanalysis, some kind of weird pre-Socratic philosophy or Heidegger or what have you, it's been liquidated at an intellectual level. And I feel a kind of moral duty to say and do something about that, not to just accept that. Even while that has happened, also for objective historical reasons. In other words, like these ideas that I consider to be non or anti-Marxist have an appeal that expresses something about reality, expresses something about social reality. But for that matter, as far as I'm concerned, that's no different from like some alt-right mysticism. You were talking about like Jordan Peterson or like, I don't know, the Proud Boys, like save your ejaculations to save your vital masculine energy, right? Like to me, that's no more or less valid than Lacan is, right? And it's all kind of bullshit. But it all speaks to something real.
Get out of here. Just get out. All right. I'm closing the stream. Everyone, it was nice. It was nice knowing you all. Cutrone's never coming back. No, and I think that there's a good case to be made that you are wrong. And I was like, how can yeah, you said that.
I was definitely teasing you, but go ahead.
I know. And we had our fun, but I did bring Todd on the next day for like a little response, and that was like a young Žižekians assemble, blah blah blah.
On this link between the repetition of failure and death drive, and to me that's the most important concept of the 20th century probably. So I think that's the one. And I think to speak to what Chris said yesterday, I think that's in Freud for sure, but it seems to get a real concrete additional development from Lacan. And then I would want to say like Slavoj really makes it he kind of makes it concrete in a way that Lacan doesn't. I guess this is my bias. I grew up, I think, around the same time he did, and I mean, part of the problem is that the translations of Lacan in the 1980s were just disastrous, right? They were disastrous. So basically no one who did not speak French knew what Lacan was saying. They just didn't in America until Slavoj wrote Sublime Object of Ideology. And I would even challenge anyone, like go back and look at every single book written on Lacan in English in the before 1989, which is when Sublime, and everyone is just wrong. Just wrong. And then all of a sudden Slavoj writes that book, and then there are books that are not wrong. So the notion that he doesn't do anything, or I just think it's crazy. And
I watched that.
Yeah, it was fun, right? And so But we never actually got a chance to let you two like talk and meet. But I want to start it off with, how did you get into politics? How did you get into theory? And why do you care about the thinkers that you care about? And who are they? And I think we'll start with Todd, and then we'll come to Chris.
Okay, so I don't know. I want to try to make this the least tedious I can. So, because who cares about my little
We all do.
existential crises when I was in high school reading Jean-Paul Sartre? I mean, that's sort of the origin of my philosophical thinking, but that's maybe the origin of so many teenage boys' philosophical thinking. So it's uninteresting. But I wanted to be a monk when I was younger, all through college even. So that was, and I also grew up I worked at, this is embarrassing. I worked on the Reagan campaign in high school. So I went to college as a right winger, but I went to play football and I went to a Quaker school. And then actually I read Marx in college, and it was a radical kind of undoing of all the things that I thought. And I came home one day and I said to my dad, like, okay, your days are numbered. You know, the proletariat's going to rise up. And he's like, I sent my son to this school and now he's a pinko. I remember this exact words. He's now a pinko communist. And so I was in college. I was very committed to Marxism and communism. And so it was only in graduate school that I encountered Freud and psychoanalysis and Hegel. Hegel was also important to me. And that's when I never left Marx's economic analysis of capital. I still, in fact, I just wrote something about that. But politically, I think I became more aligned with, in a way that I mean, I'd have to explain this, but with Freud and Hegel. I don't necessarily disagree with what Chris said about Lacan. Actually, I know you kind of took it back, but I just wrote this Cambridge introduction to Lacan, and I only did it because my friend Mari Rudy asked me to co-write it with her, and then she died, and I felt like I had to finish it, and I really felt like, God, he just is so annoying, and I think he just puts everything. We were having this discussion with Mikey about Lacan's neologisms, and I was saying that there's a whole book in French about all the words that Lacan has invented, and I just find that so annoying. And it's one of the things that annoys me about Heidegger too. To speak to someone you love, David. And I like that about Hegel and Marx, that they're not inventing Freud. They're not inventors of words, right? So I like that they discover concepts in what exists. So that's my trajectory, basically. So it was really this incredible Marxist conversion as an undergrad, and then this encounter with Freud and Hegel, and Slavoj was important in that. Like, I would have thought Lacan was worthless if it wasn't first. And I did. I had this whole, like, I was very anti-French. So it's interesting you associated me with the French and croissant, because I was very anti-French. I like despised Derrida and Deleuze, and I hated that whole line of thinking. And Lacan, I grouped in with them, and it was only through Slavoj that I saw, oh, well, maybe there's this Hegelian Marxist dimension to what Lacan is doing that's disguised in his many obfuscations. So that's sort of that's probably much too much, but that's it.
Fantastic. And how did the question go again? What was the question? It was like,
you said, how did you come to your political and philosophical position, I think is what you asked.
Yeah, and who are your key thinkers and why? Yeah.
Oh, I would just say Hegel, Marx, and Freud for me, right?
Okay.
Like those are the ones. I mean, I you're going to say I need to put Lacan in there, but I wouldn't want to do that. So. Just because I also dislike him personally so much, but I find it hard to. I know that seems like a terrible reason to not follow someone as a thinker, but I really, it's hard for me. You know, like Heidegger too. I mean, not the political about Heidegger. I don't care so much about that, but I find him just personally,
even personality-wise.
Yeah, I just mean personality. I just find him distasteful, and that's how I find Lacan. Just, you know, like having sex with patients, and I just all the kind of crap, and like I just and just the dandyism. I just the opposite of a dandy, and so I just like That's what I have to say. That's what I love about Slavoj. He's the most down to earth guy that I've, someone like I was once, we were taking him out to dinner. We're like, we can get a sandwich for you there at this nice place. He's like, no, just pull over to this CVS. He goes in and grabs a can of Spam and a quart of orange juice. He goes, this is a good dinner for me. And I thought that's my guy right there. I thought, even though I'm vegetarian, I don't eat Spam, but I thought that was just right when that happened. I was just like, that's the best. And so I really appreciate that. And you could never imagine Jacques Lacan doing that.
When I first met him, he was coming in off the street to the conference that Mikey and I attended back in, I don't know when, 2017 or 2018 or something like that. The one in Athens, Georgia. And he was coming in off the street with Russ before I knew Russ, and maybe you, I don't know, but a handful of people. All I could see was Slavoj Žižek, and I was like, oh my God, it's him. And he was talking about that because he had just done it again. He was eating his Spam. And he said that it's his favorite thing about the United States is that he can go into the gas station and get a full meal for under $5, And I was like,
I know. Yeah.
Okay. But with that said, then how about you, Chris?
So, okay, I guess I've been a Marxist since way back. And, since reading the Communist Manifesto as an adolescent. And I think that the part of Marx that always captured me was the political Marx. If we're going to, talk about it that way. Meaning, I came to philosophy fairly late. I had read some things, but really I studied it only when I was in graduate school. And so I didn't have, I had some background, but not a full appreciation of like German idealism. And Freud was someone who I encountered in high school, interpretation of dreams. But I'm not sure that I took Freud terribly seriously until later. And not even in college. Really, I got my second education in Freud teaching Freud because I taught Freud in the College Core at the University of Chicago. And I was instructed in my teaching of Freud by a Freudian. He was an actual, dyed-in-the-wool, member of the Psychoanalytic Society, Freudian. He was himself an analyst as well as a professor of human development. And so I would say that in many respects, I had the kind of reverse trajectory that a lot of young people in the last generation, like with the millennials, have had. Because a lot of people have come to it via Žižek, and then did I cut out?
Just for a second,
okay,
it'll be okay.
Normal I think. Okay, so I really came to a different kind of appreciation through Adorno of philosophy and also of psychology and sociology. So I, like I said, I gave myself a kind of a second education in graduate school. Up to that point, I had really studied Marx and Marxism from a political science, political theory point of view. So Adolf Reed was a mentor of mine, and he's a political scientist. And I did basically a political science major at Hampshire College, and I studied history of revolutions in the 20th century. So Russian, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, and Cuban revolutions, and the Iranian Revolution. So I studied those things in detail. I did these long research projects on those things and really approached them through political history, political theory, not even political philosophy, really. And when I was in college, certainly postmodernism was very much in vogue. Everybody was a Foucauldian. Judith Butler was like an underground, zine hit with the students. They had a zine called Judy, fanzine of Judith Butler. And I'm gay, so I was surrounded by people who were into that queering everything kind of mentality. But meanwhile, I was like a hardcore Marxist. I was a member of a Trotskyist group. And in many respects, I was even more Marxist than they were. Because I'd bring up questions to them about but where's the Marxism? and they would be kind of annoyed with me about that. Adolf Reed also would sort of sometimes get annoyed with me about that as well. Even though he's a much more hardcore Marxist than people tend to know through his writings. He's like a left communist, like a council communist, like a real kind of hardcore Marxist in that way. So that's, in terms of thinkers, Marx kind of stands out. But then I did have this second education when I did my grad work on Adorno. And then the Frankfurt School kind of opened up things for me in a particular way. And I think I would not have been interested in the Frankfurt School if I hadn't already had a background in Marxism and in a real kind of appreciation of the actual history there, the political history of Marxism. And then the Frankfurt School gave me this other kind of appreciation for classical sociology, for Freud, and for philosophy. I think Adorno taught me philosophy. If I had a teacher in philosophy, it was Adorno. And then, like, in terms of a living teacher, it was Robert Pippin at the University of Chicago. And so those were and Moishe Postone was an important teacher for me, but it was a battle between me and him because he was against traditional Marxism. And I kind of took his point, I took his criticism of traditional Marxism, but I also thought he was selling it short. He was selling historical Marxism short. So I would say that's how I came to where I've been, and then I've had this other public life with Platypus. Without Platypus, I would have just taught Frankfurt School critical theory academically with this kind of understanding of the history of Marxism in the background. With the Frankfurt School, I'll just say this, because this is probably something that maybe, Todd, you and I have in common generationally, is the reception of the Frankfurt School in the 80s and 90s was very eager to assimilate Frankfurt School with postmodernism.
Mhm.
There was a lot of like, oh, they're saying the same thing, but differently. Whereas I had, because of my Marxist background, I knew that they were opposed to that. They were opposed to the Heideggerianism. They were opposed to this kind of legacy. And they really understood it as like a post-fascist, like, Habermas famously called the postmodernists the young conservatives. And I always thought that he was right about that.
Quick little follow up on that then. So if you have three main thinkers, my initial guess was like I was gonna be like it's gonna be Marx, Lenin, and Adorno. Then I was like, but wait, is Freud?
Absolutely, yes. No, Freud's there. Freud is there. I mean, and Hegel's very important to me, but I also have to say Nietzsche and Kant are very important to me too, in terms of philosophers. Kant is, extremely important. I feel like, and maybe this is the Pippin influence, but also Adorno's influence. I don't think that Hegel really makes sense without Kant. So, when I think of the thinkers who are near and dear to me, yes, I mean, in terms of being a political thinker, Marx and Lenin also, it's funny because Lenin has this kind of strange currency, whether people are for or against him. I think that they have a kind of caricatured image of Lenin that they either like or they dislike. This kind of ruthless guy, this kind of ends justifies the means guy. They either love him for that or they hate him for that. And I think that that's not true. That certainly isn't what's important to me about Lenin as a thinker, or as a political figure, as a historical figure. So those would be, but they're very different. Marx is different. Lenin's different. Adorno's different. It's not like Marx and Lenin are the same. They're actually quite different from each other in many respects. And of course, Adorno's different yet again. So it really depends on what we're talking about. But I would say that one of the challenges for me, especially teaching the humanities and teaching critical theory in that context, has been I think that people tend to be pretty naive about politics and about basic questions of political theory. Again, old style political science, because now political science is more of a quantified statistical discipline, right? But like old style, I mean, I guess what would be called political philosophy, really. I feel like most readers of Marx and most people interested in Marxism tend to not really think of it in that way, and that's the way I've always thought about it. I studied with political scientists in college, and like I said, I studied political history, a history of movements, history of parties, you know, um, and that kind of set of concerns.
Thank you. So, one thing I want to just say up front is that this is also really cool because I haven't had an opportunity to really be plugging your guys' courses that you're teaching at Theory Underground this year. And so I will be putting it up on the screen at some point while they're talking. They won't see it, but everybody on the YouTube side will. People listening to this on the podcast in the future, the links will be in the description, blah, blah, blah. But the reason that I wanted these two courses to happen, Introduction to Marxism, as well as Lacan's Seminar 11, is because, well, Lacan's Seminar 11 is basically an introduction to the Lacanian version of psychoanalysis. And so basically on the one side, it's like the sort of platypus approach to Marx, which is very much like this political Marx, which is not, it doesn't get the best representation on my channel, that's for sure. And Chris is always just like so generous, even though like, yeah, we might have our disagreements and stuff. And I'm always there to learn if someone's got something to teach. And the thing is it's one thing for a professor to just be teaching something in their own little world. It's another for them to spend the better part of a couple of decades trying to bring that not just to other people like, oh, Jordan Peterson's just got a message to tell the world or whatever. No, it's like you actually, you haven't been a public intellectual that way. You've been kind of behind the scenes organizing conversations between all kinds of people that are actively doing politics or who are super disaffected. And that includes people who are, I mean, it gets crazy. Like the people that you will put on panels, you get in all kinds of trouble for it because some of them are untouchables.
Always suspend somebody to invite somebody.
Right? It is. It always is. Yeah. And so to me, it's like that makes you a kind of authority when it comes to Marx. Now, maybe not the, but I think that anybody who wants to talk about political Marxism had better spend some time with Platypus, right? And so that's kind of how I see the course that you'll be teaching, and then of course, Seminar 11 in July. It's going to be amazing. So Seminar 11 in July and Introduction to Marxism with Chris Cutrone will be in October. And so I guess the big question then, and Rudy had actually suggested this in the chat, but it's kind of already where I was thinking about it with Mikey, is the question of dialectics itself. What does that mean to you? And I know that for Chris, it's going to be largely informed by Adorno and negative dialectics. And for Todd, it's going to be this going to Hegel through Lacan that Žižek does. And so like, in a sense, I don't know if it's fair to call it negative dialectics versus retroactive dialectics. Todd, how would you characterize this kind of dialectics?
Well, I think it's Hegelian. I don't know that it's Lacanian. I mean, maybe, is Lacan, I mean, I think there are ways in which Lacan is unbeknownst to himself Hegelian, right? I mean, I think there's a certain period in his thinking when he is, but namely around Seminar 11. But I just think it's Hegelian. I think my conception of dialectics is completely Hegelian, and it's the idea is that everything exists. I think two things, right? Like everything exists in relation. Like Lukács says in History and Class Consciousness, the name dialectics just means like thinking everything as a totality, right? And I think that means like seeing the relation between, like thinking of nothing in isolation from itself. So there's a kind of anti-liberal, liberal in the sense of like we begin as isolated subjects, with some kind of anti-liberal sense to dialectics, right? And then the second thing is that when you see the relation, then you see the way in which the relation is a contradictory one, right? Like that there's there's not like a, there's not a harmonious, there's no, for Hegel, I think this is, to me, the great insight. This is what he means by absolute knowing, that there's no harmonious relation at all. And there's no, and this would be where like my reading is, would be contra Robert Pippin's. Like, I don't think there's, like, you get to the end of there's not mutual recognition at the end. And certainly this guy, Robert Brandom, wrote a great book about Hegel. It's a commentary on phenomenology, basically, called A Spirit of Trust. It's 800. It's like twice as long as Phenomenology. It's a great book. But the point for him is that you get to this point of Hegel's idea, or his ideal even, Brandon puts it, is one of mutual recognition. I don't think that's the case. Like, I think that part of what Hegel's great insight is, and I think in a way, this is what Adorno thinks of as negative dialectics, but I would say this is already Hegel's own project, is that all we can do is reconcile ourselves. So the term in German is Versöhnung, like to reconcile or reconciliation. All we can do is reconcile ourselves to this contradiction, to this failure, to this disharmony, right? And that, to me, that's what dialectics names.
Right. So I would say, okay, so this is where my disagreement comes in. So I mentioned Kant, right? So I would say that, the reality of the subject, meaning, and also the actuality of the subject. So Hegel's infamous comment, the real is the actual and the actual is the real, right? So in other words, the substance of the subject also. And I don't think that's well, first of all, I would start off by saying I'm not sure about like liberalism starting off with the isolated individual. There are some strands of liberalism that are like that. But I would say that liberalism is also the source of our idea about the individual being a product of society. In other words, the social individual. That individuality is an achievement. It's not a starting point. It's a kind of a result. It's not an origin. And with respect to Hegel, I mean, the negative dialectic part from Adorno, it's actually based on a phrase of Lukács, which is the positive and negative dialectics in Hegel. Meaning that for some reason, what Hegel thought together became separated after Hegel. In other words, left and right Hegelianism. And that problem that was at the inception of Marxist thought recurs in the 20th century. Meaning Marx had to deal with the division of left and right Hegelianism, or young and old Hegelianism, a kind of a progressive Hegelianism or revolutionary Hegelianism versus a conservative Hegelianism. And Marx was not simply on one side or the other of that. And in many respects, Stalinism in the 20th century reproduces that problem. Meaning that Marxism in the 20th century becomes divided between a kind of affirmative Marxism and a more critical Marxism, or a more positive Marxism and a more negative Marxism. And that's kind of a not a matter simply of thinking, that's actually in the reality of society in history, that actually occurs. Right. So that's where I think maybe for me the difference between Freud and Lacan also comes in, which is to say that I think that Freud might, I teach Paul Ricoeur, so he's the coiner of this expression, the masters of suspicion. Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud as the masters of suspicion, that they make us not just doubt, not just be skeptical of, but also to be suspicious of any claims to knowledge, right? So Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud as the originators of suspicion about any claims to knowing the world. I don't think that Freud actually is that. I also don't think that Marx and Nietzsche are that, but I certainly don't think that Freud is that, because I think that Freud starts out with the capacities of the ego and the possibilities of the ego developing even in adulthood, you know. So I don't think that it's about reconciling oneself to the impossibility. You know, it's more about the capacities and the possibilities. So that's why I started with Kant. Kant and Hegel seem to be about, given all the mitigating factors, still we have actual subjective agency. Freedom is possible in history, and not just at an individual level, but at a collective level. Social freedom is possible, and individuals can participate in that despite misrecognitions, despite contradictions. And I think that that's where there's a certain kind of pessimism that sits in the 20th century. And I associate that with also 20th century readings of Hegel. So I take it that someone like Lacan is influenced by Hegel, but via the 20th century reception by people like Kojev and others, and who are basically expressing what for Hegel would have been a pre-bourgeois kind of situation, like lordship and bondage, master and slave dialectic. In other words, Hegel thought that world history had overcome that kind of antagonism. But in the 20th century, it seems like we're kind of back to that. We're back to a kind of constitution of the subject, right? Rather than being able to proceed on the basis of, okay, the bourgeois subject has been established and now is encountering this problem of capitalism and has the capacity to overcome it. You know, the workers as bourgeois subjects have the capacity of dealing with this problem of capitalism and overcoming it. I think that there's a great deal of not only skepticism and doubt about that and pessimism in the 20th century, but there's even suspicion of it. Right. So, and warranted by the Stalinist experience, you know, all sorts of things happen that seem to warrant not only doubt and skepticism, but even suspicion about Marxism as a political project. Granted. And yet, I think that's still our only way out. that's still the only actual possibility. And so I don't see Marx as saying that the bourgeois subject is not real. I don't see Nietzsche saying that the bourgeois subject is not real. I don't see Freud saying that the bourgeois subject is not real. I also don't see the Frankfurt School saying that the bourgeois subject is not real. In other words, it might be in distress, it might be in extremis, it might be in self-contradiction, but it also has the capacities for overcoming that contradiction. And not in some, you know, absolute way, but to take the next step in freedom. The next step in freedom is possible beyond capitalism. We may not believe that, but I uphold the idea that people thought that and they weren't wrong about it.
Well, okay. Thanks, Chris. So I would just say a couple things. I think, look, your insistence that Hegel is your point about this terrible split that happens afterward, I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, that's like one of the great disasters in the history of thinking. So that's something, I'll come back to that. But I think that you're absolutely right to say Kant is the fundamental point of, I mean, Kant and Fichte, right? The fundamental point of reference for Hegel, right? And I think you're right that Kant is probably, in my view, the great, I mean, or not, if not Hegel, the great theorist of freedom. And so what I was saying about reconciling ourselves to contradiction is in no way was I saying that means that freedom is impossible. I mean, I think that is
go on freedom. Yeah, let's not reconcile.
I mean, I think that's Hegel's image of what freedom is. I think that's Hegel's image of what freedom is. That freedom lies in, and I think this is an interesting, to me, difference between Hegel and Marx. That I think for Hegel, freedom lies in the embrace of contradiction. And I think maybe, I mean, I have Marxist friends that I have this kind of debate with, and they're like, well, no, I mean, you could see maybe Marx is saying this and that, like, it's really like that the communist revolution would allow us to have this kind of embrace, right? That he's only
Right.
when he says that, like this line in the preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy, when he says like bourgeois society is the last contradictory form, like, well, maybe he's saying in economic terms, but we still could have this like ontological grasp of contradiction, which for Hegel, I think, is the basis of our freedom. So I think that I absolutely agree that we have to think in terms of freedom. We have to think in terms of overcoming capital, because as you say, I think that's absolutely right. Like if capital is the end of the line, then there's no way out of the global disaster, right? Like I think that's in total agreement with you on that. And I also think that it seems like it's a shame today. What you said is exactly right. We're in this like hermeneutics of suspicion, right? Like that's like no one talks about Ricoeur, but he's kind of won the day on that, I think. Like, and you're right that he's reduced these thinkers that are not really thinkers of suspicion. So, I mean, of course, it's like Descartes, right? It's doubt, but in service of a larger project, right? So I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think that there's that if you can't think, that like just the way I've heard you speak about this, and I thought it was very compelling that there's this kind of like, just kind of reflexive identitarian movement on the, I'm even hesitant to call it the left, but like on the liberal, let's say the liberal left, right? And I think that's not an emancipatory position, and it's an abandonment of freedom. And I think everything you say on that is exactly right. So I'm totally with you. My point is just about the idea of contradiction, that for Hegel, it's not that freedom lies in this encounter with it, because then you see, like, because in contradiction you see that you don't fit in, right? Like this like failure. And I take your point about liberalism. I think that I was probably unfair about that. But I think that in contradiction you feel that you see that you don't, this non-fitting in, I think, is absolutely crucial to your to your freedom, right? Like I think that's Adorno's point too. But yeah. So anyway, so that would just be my. So in essence, I completely agree. It's just maybe even just a terminological, semantic kind of.
It does become, it becomes terminological. And maybe for the benefit of the audience, I think that you and I could clarify. I mean, first of all, of course, when English speakers hear contradiction, they hear illogical. Right. And when they hear something that doesn't make sense, it's like a logical fallacy, or it's incoherent at the level of a consistent thought. And that's, of course, not what we mean by contradiction. Right. We mean real contradiction, and, like not just a Socratic contradiction, like a thought error that you improve dialogically through clarification, through debate. A real contradiction. My hesitation about this with respect to Hegel, I go all the way back to Marx, to the early Marx, 1843, 1844. So, a critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, and then a critique of the Hegelian dialectic and philosophy as a whole in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, where he just says, of course, Hegel is true, but it's a metaphysics of labor. And it wasn't always true, and it need not always be true. In other words, it's true for our moment. It's true and it's true in two different respects. It's true as an image of freedom, bourgeois emancipation through labor. But then it's also true as unfreedom in capitalism. And that's the challenge. So, in other words, like that freedom lies in the contradiction. I think that Hegel has a very positive view, like a productive view of contradiction. But I think that form of freedom in capitalism has actually become a form of unfreedom. And so the challenge is, can we think freedom, however incipiently, beyond this kind of bourgeois dialectic? And I think that's, by the way, where Heidegger and his progeny, the French fries, that's where there's a kernel of truth, actually. Because, again, they're seeing the unfreedom in the Hegelian dialectic. Right? They're grasping the truth of the unfreedom that's articulated in the Hegelian dialectic. But again, what gets elided is the distinction between a kind of bourgeois emancipatory moment, that kind of productive, constructive aspect of freedom, which still goes on under capitalism. It's still happening, but it's now contradicted by this other thing, which is that actually the dialectic in that sense is what's keeping us in this form of unfreedom now. Right. So that's the tricky part. It's kind of like there are two sides to the contradiction, or there are two sides to the dialectic, we might say. So the dialectic itself would need to be overcome. That would be the Adorno point, that there might be freedom beyond dialectical contradiction. The dialectical contradiction might have described a process of freedom, but maybe there's going to be a freedom beyond that dialectical process. That would be my suggestion.
I see. Yeah, I mean, that's really good, because I think that articulates, because that is not my view at all. So that nicely articulates the difference.
All right. We're going to take a quick break so that I can tell you about the upcoming courses that Todd McGowan and Chris Cutrone are each teaching at Theory Underground this summer. For the month of July 2024, Todd McGowan is teaching Lacan Seminar 11, which could also be thought of as Introduction to Lacan. Then in October, Chris Cutrone is teaching Introduction to Marxism. If you wish to enroll, you can either sign up for the classes as standalone courses, or you can become a member at Theory Underground through the monthly membership. That would then unlock a 50% off discount for each of these two courses, as well as all other courses taught by guest lecturers at Theory Underground, and 90% off on everything that I, David McKerracher, am teaching here at TU. All right. If you're interested in that stuff, look at the description. We'll get right back to the show. Here we go.
That's right. So
could you help me out here really quick then, Todd?
Yeah.
Because there's a point in the stream after a certain amount of hours when my brain gets a little mushy, perhaps, but I
assume so. Yeah.
Okay.
We're at the wrong end, man. I don't know why you put us here. We're getting you at your worst.
Yeah. Yeah. But I was just telling the chat, you guys are doing so good without me. I don't even need to do anything here. You guys I could leave, but really quick. Todd was so clear. It's like dialectics. He boiled it down to two things. Of course, it's a bunch of other things, but he made it very easy for us all with its relations, and those relations are contradictions, and that's the starting point. And then Cutrone did this sweeping thing, and I was trying to hold on to the threads, and then it was slipping away, and then it went deeper, and then back and forth, and then you're but this is where we disagree, and I'm like, what is the disagreement?
Wait.
Please lay it out for me. Yeah, what do you understand the disagreement to be, Todd?
It? And then
yes, please.
Let me do it, and then let Chris say how I missed it. Okay, so I think that I'm trying to say that that freedom is for Hegel, and and not for Kant. For Kant, freedom is precisely our ability to. This is what's the radical move of Kant, right? That freedom is our ability to give ourselves a law, impose a law on ourselves, right? And that's completely against. Chris is going to be upset with me because I'm going to say the word again in a pejorative way. It's completely against the liberal tradition of how we conceive of freedom. Concept in this way, anti-liberal. But okay,
it's
but
Rousseauian.
Hegel's note. What? Right,
it's
right,
Rousseauian.
right. Yes, exactly. Hegel's point, I think, is that freedom is attained when we grasp our contradictory structure as a subject and our contradictory relation to the social order. And Hegel thinks that this is a unsurpassable point in human history. He does not think it's this is a point that is just a historical insight he thinks that we've got it. And he says, he's very clear, this is the end of history. He doesn't mean things aren't going to happen. What he means is once you uncover, which he thinks he has, the fact that contradiction, and Chris is right, that it's not this Socratic like I contradict you, you contradict me, and through that method we get to some kind of truth. That's not what contradiction means for Hegel. In fact, Hegel obeys. Sorry, this is a little detour. Hegel obeys the principle of non-contradiction to discover the inevitability of contradiction. So it's a little bit confusing. But he thinks we're never going to get beyond that insight, like that insight, and then we're never going to get beyond that materially because, and we can. But he doesn't think we can't find better ways
self-consciousness
to relate to
that we've achieved it, right?
Philosophically, but he's not an idealist in this stupid way. Like he thinks like, no, society has to change to be equal to this insight about freedom.
But we have the resources.
So it's not,
we have the resources for it. Yeah.
Right. But I think there's a real difference because, and this is true, Adorno thinks that there's some point beyond this dialectical like in Minimum Morality, I think he's very clear about this. Like so that beyond contradiction would be some like a togetherness of difference, right? Like that would be utopia. So I think that there is this. I think that would be how I would characterize it. Like, is this like point of dialectical contradiction? That's really that's the great insight, or is there this movement beyond that dialectical endpoint, right? I think that's, to me, that's how I see the opposition playing it.
Right. So let's bring Marx into it between Hegel and Adorno. So, or Lukács for that matter, the historicization of the Hegelian dialectic, right? And it's not to say that Hegel was wrong. It's rather that in his historical moment, the only way to grasp freedom was to say the freedom of the present, of his time, was the result of all prior human history, that could be appropriated in a particular way and achieve a certain kind of self-consciousness. And the basic contours of that self-consciousness were achieved. And then after that, it would be a matter of working through the details of it. Right. So it's not that history is going to stop by any means.
Right.
Actually, freedom is going to continue to be explored. But it's going to be explored in essentially these terms. And in a way, he says people were always exploring freedom in these terms. They just didn't know it.
Right.
Whereas now we know it. Right. Whereas I think that what Marx does, and also what Adorno and Lukács also and Adorno follow Marx on this point, is to say that, well, actually, history was not always about this dialectical process. In other words, it must necessarily look that way in retrospect, right? So the anatomy of the human is the key to the anatomy of the ape, right? So it's like a real knowledge of the past, but it's also a specific knowledge of the past. And so I think that the danger is like that one would raise a kind of romanticism, or, like Ricoeur would be an example, but Foucault would be an example, like other ways of knowing. Oh, don't forget that before bourgeois society, before modernity, there were these other ways of knowing, and holding that out as like a model for the future.
Isn't like Dawn of Everything the great example
almost like,
of what you're... Sorry, Chris. Do you know this book, Dawn of Everything? Isn't it a great example of what you're just talking about?
It is. That's right. Is that Yuval Harari?
No, it's not the Harari one.
Who's the writer?
It's the new Graeber.
The guy, it's the Graeber and David. What's the other guy's name?
It's Graeber. That's right. It's Graeber. That's right.
Yeah.
It's a posthumous Graeber. That's right.
Yeah.
No, that's right. And that's right. Exactly. And so that kind of romanticism. The question is, what's the rational kernel in that? In recognizing that there was a difference, and that this kind of bourgeois totality that's come into existence, it's real and it can incorporate difference, but that in a way it projects back onto the past a dialectical process that wasn't necessarily there. So the way that I like to put it is, I understand why Hegel says that there was a dialectic coming out of the ancient Mediterranean world into the Germanic Christian world that gave birth to bourgeois society and freedom. I understand his point, but I also would just maintain, you know what, the Middle Ages were not really dialectical in the way that capitalism is, right? In other words, lord and serf is not at all like capitalist and worker, actually, or capital and wage labor. Very different thing than the caste system of the pre-bourgeois world. And so again, like, I understand his point because bourgeois society makes it so. The bourgeois society makes it so there is this history coming out of the ancient Mediterranean world into the Germanic Christian Middle Ages. There is a sort of a through line that's established. But what that tends to suggest, and I'm not even sure that Hegel, again, I don't think that Hegel was saying, you know, the story of freedom is over. It's like a move that all philosophers do, right? Although I do think we have to take seriously the idea that Kant, as he said, invented philosophy, and there was no philosophy before
No,
Kant.
agreed.
And we have to take seriously Hegel's idea that Hegel completed philosophy. So the 25 years of philosophy, born with Kant, finished by Hegel. I love that. But of course, it's not really literally true, right? In other words, you know, we could say that all philosophy after Hegel is like sub-Hegelian. We could say that. But we could also say, because it's in the era of capitalism, that in many respects Hegel could not anticipate, that the philosophy that comes after Hegel is trying to think through something. There's a discontent with Hegel. It's kind of like Hegel completed philosophy, but then all of a sudden people start pulling at the threads. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, all sorts of people. And that the reason that they're doing that is because this consciousness of freedom is actually inadequate to capitalism in some respects. And not just in the details, right? But at a more substantial level. So
Yeah.
that's, you know,
So-
where I feel like that's maybe the difference. You
Yeah,
know,
there's
and
so
I
much
want-
to say there.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
There
I
is,
want
there
I
is.
want you guys to be able to return to it, to unpack it some more. But also, really quick, I want to dig into something a little bit. And when I was originally saying the thing about how I could have pulled any professor who teaches this stuff to talk, but it's another thing when, you know, all this organizing, kind of doing underground theory in a sense. That's why you're the godfather of underground theory in a sense, right? In the Marxist scene, you've been doing all this organizing, right? Well, but the thing is I don't know what the Lacanian scene would be without the LAC conference. And that was the other part of that thread that I forgot to bring back. And it's like, Todd is like if it wasn't for you and a couple other amazing people, Todd, like LAC wouldn't have been the thing that it's been for so long. And I think you very early in the conversation were kind of just like, yeah, Lacan sleeping with his patients, you know, making up words, asshole. Yeah, I could just stick to Freud. And it's like, but come on, you would not be able to do what you do with psychoanalysis if it wasn't for Lacan, and you're the LAC guy. And I really want you at this point now to bring in why Lacan matters for your politics. But first, I want to take a step back from everything we've been doing, and I want you both give it to me quick, short and sweet here. What is the left for you? And I'll preface that by saying Chris Cutrone, he's the last Marxist. He's the last Marxist, and and in the lore, and the slogan of, or the motto, I guess, the battle cry of platypus affiliated societies: the left is dead, long live the left. And I'll just say the thing that they never say, the funny thing, if you actually look into it, the platypus thing, it's a wonderful story that comes from Engels. I'll let Chris explain it to you all, but do explain the story because it's amazing. But yeah, what is the left? We'll start with you, Chris.
Okay, so you know, there's the left in our time, and then there's the left historically. And I guess for me, and of course this is a peculiarity that doesn't make sense to many people. For me, the left means Marxism. In other words, I take that term from the history of Marxism, the idea that there was like within the history of Marxism, a left and a right, like Rosa Luxemburg versus Eduard Bernstein, or Lenin and the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks, that there's a left and a right that way, but that it only makes sense within that history, and we've become deranged from that. And of course, now left means like progressive capitalist, right? Progressive liberal capitalist. And in the United States, we have, really just two versions of liberalism. We have progressive liberalism and we have conservative liberalism, and both of them get bent out of shape, trip over themselves over capitalism. And so I think there's even a question of whether or not the progressives really are the progressives and whether the conservatives really are the conservatives in terms of the actual dynamics at work, because this is what capitalism does. So Marxism, like to say the left is dead, long live the left, it's the king is dead, long live the king, right? Meaning that the spirit might continue, but would have to be embodied in a different way. So it's not about like people on the left. It's more like the left as a project, the left as a principle has sort of vacated the scene. Marxism has vacated the scene, but could come back. Could the spirit of it could come back, and maybe even in a post-Marxist or non-Marxist way. I'm always open to that if it's earned, if it's legit. Now, the platypus point, so my friend Richard Rubin came up with this when we thought we were going to start a journal. Instead, we started an organization with some students, which is much better than starting a journal. And it's the anecdote from Friedrich Engels, who read about the platypus in the newspaper, and he was like, oh no, this has got to be a fraud, because there could be no such creature, right? Because he had a very teleological understanding of natural evolution. And then he was chagrined to find that there was actually a platypus, that they really did exist. And so this is a little bit of an object lesson, that if there were to be a rebirth of an authentic emancipatory political movement within capitalism, seeking to go beyond capitalism, it might be unrecognizable in terms of people's assumptions today. It may not fit into people's established conceptions or classifications, categorizations. The favorite four-field meme: authoritarian, libertarian, capitalist, socialist. It's like, well, where would actual like historical Marxism fit on that? It would be kind of everywhere and nowhere on that map, right? It wouldn't fit, exactly the way people think about socialism as a kind of statism, nor would it fit like capitalism if it's like, I don't know, libertarian, anarcho-capitalism. It wouldn't fit authoritarian versus libertarian either. It would sort of defy that kind of categorization, and yet I think that that's what needs to come back, right? Pardon me. So I think that it's an important symbol, the platypus, because again, it's neither fish nor fowl, if you know that expression. And it seems to be a mashup of things, right? So because Engels thought that some taxidermists had taken body parts from different animals and had created this cadaver of a platypus, right? So the only evidence that they had of a platypus was a cadaver, and he was like, somebody made this thing out of like incongruent body parts. And then he saw the platypus in the zoo alive, swimming around, and he's like, oh shit, it exists, right? It's not like made up, a mashup of incompatible parts, which is the way original historical Marxism has to appear today. It has to appear to be all over the map and nowhere on the map, and it has to appear as a mashup of incompatible parts from the present's owned assumptions. So today, the way things are classified politically, it would have to appear as some kind of weird monster, made up of incompatible things.
I'm glad to hear it from your mouth, because just reading it on the website, I've been under the assumption now for a long time that the takeaway was supposed to be different, and the takeaway was that Marxists cannot recognize what the left has become?
Maybe today. In other words, certainly the people who call themselves Marxists today have a very hidebound understanding. In other words, here's another Adornoism. Our thinking should not be reduced to classifying things. Like, our concepts should not be about slotting things in, pigeonholing things, just sort of mapping things out and classifying things, like saying, okay, this is this thing and that thing's the other thing. That's like the very opposite of thinking. It's what Adorno in the Frankfurt School called positivism, right? And if that's all our mental function is, if that's all thinking is, then that's a shame. If it's just about like pattern recognition or something, like this, I explain this to my students. I'm like, thinking is not what you think it is. It's not like just cognitive processing, because animals do that. Humans do something else. They do something more synthetic and creative when they think. They're not just recognizing and slotting things into recognizable categories, right? At least actual thinking, right? So maybe
Right.
99% of the time we're not thinking in that way. That's fine, right? It goes back to Kant, right? So, he basically says, look, empiricism and rationalism can describe like 99.99% of our cognitive processes, but neither can explain that one little bit that happens sometimes, namely freedom. Our cognitive freedom, our thinking. They can't explain that as a synthetic faculty, as like a creative process. And that's actually what needs to be explained, because if philosophy can't explain that, then you don't really need philosophy. You can do science, you can do other things, right? You only need philosophy to explain the freedom of our thinking. You don't need philosophy to explain a cognitive process that we share with animals, basically.
Thank you. All right. And then,
right,
Todd.
So certainly Marxists today, most people who call themselves Marxists are not thinking. They use Marxism as a substitute for thinking. Let's put it that way.
How about you, Todd? What is the left?
So to me, I like what Chris is doing. This idea, like I agree totally that what's calls itself left today is often not what I would call the left, and I think it's imperative to do something like what he's describing, like have our own conception that then we don't just say like, oh, these are the choices that we have available to us, and that's just what we're gonna opt for. But instead to say, no, there's this thing that doesn't fit, right? That we're gonna promulgate, like we're gonna take up that. And I think that's absolutely imperative. And I'm just gonna put it in my own little jargon, and I apologize for that. But to me, like to be left is that to be in struggling on behalf of the universality of non-belonging. Like that's just what it is. Like leftism has to be universal, and it has to be about this commitment to this a utter non-belonging. Like there's no group to belong to, like no symbolic identity. And this is getting to you wanted me to talk about the Lacan influence, so this would be the Lacan influence, right? So Lacan's, I think I wanted to say a couple things about what I think is important about him, because you're right, I have probably wrongly dismissed his importance for me. And I here's what I think. I think two things. One, I think he has this one concept, and so he theorizes desire. Chris brought up the name of Alexander Kojève, this great Hegelian thinker, and who really shaped basically French thought of the 20th century. I mean, Kojève, I think there's a really good argument that Kojève is, along with maybe like Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and Lukács, the great thinker of the 20th century, right? So I think that doesn't even seem to be an extreme position. And one thing Kojève does is try to bring Heidegger, Marx, and Hegel together into an amalgam, right? But he's the one that theorizes desire as the desire for recognition. And so that's influential on Lacan. But what Lacan says is, well, that's not really the extent of our desire. Like actually, we don't desire the other's recognition. We desire something that actually blocks what we want, something that causes us to miss the other's recognition, right? Something that gets in the way of it. And so his notion of this objet art, which I think he says it's in his seminar 21, he says, this is the one thing that I invented. And I think usually people, when they say that, they're wrong. I think Lacan was right. This is the one thing he invented. And I think that idea that our desire is structured around not the object that we desire, but instead the thing that is slightly in the way of the object is really an incredible insight and unanticipated historically, not by Freud, maybe by Freud, but not theoretically thought through by Freud. So I think that's really important. That and the great example of this is if you see one of my twin sons drove our car into the Chipotle, the pole in front of a Chipotle, and so the bumper is now bent in, right, and then the bottom fell off, and there's all these problems. So I look at that and I'm like, you know what? If he just hadn't have done that, that car was in fine shape, right? So that little dent in the bumper is functioning as an objet art, right? Like it's a bad thing, right? I wish their bumper was, but it makes a nice front of the car desirable. Otherwise, I look out the front of my car and I don't give a shit. It's just it's an old Prius, it barely runs, it's fine. I don't care. But now I look at it and I go, wow, I wish it had a nice front on there, right? Like so that little thing in the bumper that caused by that Chipotle pull, that's objet art for Lacan, right? So, and I think that you can think about that. The great example is in the person that you're in love with or desire, the way in which they have some slight little defect. I wish they could just not have that slight, but that's the thing that if it wasn't for that, they would be undesirable, right? So that's a really important idea for
Or
Lacan,
unloved.
You're right.
Unloved.
Right,
like
right,
in other words,
unloved. Yeah.
because that's exactly the other thing about we shouldn't confuse those things. In other words, maybe I'm just going to be a hopeless romantic for a second. But we love the flaw in the other.
No, that's absolutely Lacan's point.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely right. Lacan's point. Absolutely Lacan's point. Right. And so I remember this person that was in my for my sins when I was in 6th grade. I was sent to a Christian school because my parents thought I was headed down the wrong path, and there was a person there that was she was like perfect looking, right, and no one desired her, and it was the most fascinating thing, right? Like, and it's exactly what you said, Chris. Like, she just was too perfect to be desirable, right? And I think we see people like that all the time. Like you see them and you're like, I couldn't love that person because there's no flaw that I could latch onto. And I think that's one of Lacan's great insights, that he allows us to kind of think love and desire in this other sort of way. And then thing. Sorry.
Okay, go ahead. I was going to just say, I'll throw a little wrinkle in there, which is to say, desire as a source of suffering. Love is a source of suffering. In other words, I think that what you're describing, because I think, again, to like an English-speaking audience, the French have they're kind of the Romans. They're the last holdout of the Romans, right? And so I feel like desire, love, it's all about suffering, right? And I don't think that connotates quite the same way to our audience, right? Because they're thinking of love as the end of suffering rather than the structure of suffering or the meaning of suffering. And by the way, so this is, again, maybe some little difference, which is the contradiction. In other words, contradiction as suffering, and also absolute knowing as suffering, but suffering with meaning, right? And I think that there are a couple of ways of thinking about that. One is post festum, the Owl of Minerva flying at dusk, the meaning of historical suffering and the meaning of present suffering. Mm-hmm. But I also think we do have to overcome this form of suffering. Doesn't mean overcoming all suffering, but maybe the suffering we have in capitalism, that it's meaningless now. In other words, that we're suffering meaninglessly in capitalism, and we do have to overcome that, which doesn't mean overcoming suffering per se. It doesn't mean entering into a realm of meaninglessness. But the political project is about overcoming suffering, not reconciling ourselves to it.
Right.
And that's where I think that the psychology of acknowledging and recognizing our suffering is a little bit different. Although in the 20th century, I could see how it would be associated with the project of the historical left. In other words, that there's a moment of disenchantment in the mid 20th century where it's like the utopian project of the left seems to be an attempt to overcome suffering that has only produced more suffering. And I think that the move of Heidegger and the post-Heideggerians, and even like Kojève, his understanding of Hegel, is to basically say it's a mistake to try to overcome suffering, and that it actually makes suffering worse. And it threatens to produce a kind of meaningless suffering. And I think what they did was they projected onto the Marxist project what is actually capitalism. Right? That they sort of start to associate capitalism with a kind of institutionalization of a kind of the meaningless suffering of capitalism. And then they were like, no, we can't, we reject this attempt to overcome suffering that only produces more suffering, greater suffering. And the task is for us to accept the horizon of our suffering, right?
Yeah, but a couple things. Yeah,
kind of
no,
absolute meaning of our existence.
In many ways, I agree totally with what you're saying, right? So in many ways, and I think that yeah, like the project of capitalism, the promise of the commodity form, is this promise of an infinite excess, right? Of like I'm going to overcome suffering through the commodity, right? Like the idea of, I always think of John Galt's motor, right? This like thing that's like self-perpetuating, right? So you don't have to, you put a little labor into it, and then it just creates value just on its own, right? Like it's purely self. And I think that's in certain ways the capitalist fantasy. So I think that what you're saying is right, but I think, and I do also agree that there's a danger to this, like, oh, accept suffering, that way we don't. But I think look, to the promise of escaping suffering is a capitalist promise. I mean, I just think, point the line, right? Like that's the capitalist promise. And so, but I think the key is to say, can you see the way in which, and I think this is like, so I'm going to say another nice thing about Lacan. I think this is what's great about Lacan, that for him, like, can you see the way in which you're suffering? It's not just this Heideggerian accept our suffering, etc. Right? It's instead like, can't you see the way in which our suffering is tied to is the way that we enjoy? Like that's, I mean, this, and I think there's all these Lacanian people that complain about you can't translate jouissance as enjoyment, because what they think what is lost precisely is dimension of suffering that's attached to jouissance that is not captured in the English enjoyment. I hate that kind of thing, but I do think that's one of the Lacan's great ideas, really. And I think it seems to me like that's not this romanticization of suffering that you're rightfully afraid of, right? Like that seems like a different thing. It's like a way to say, okay, yeah, we can transform. We should be trying to transform society, transform our relationship to our suffering, right? In a way so that we can, I mean, like, to me, like sometimes, like Frederick Jameson in Political Unconscious says, in the future, we won't even suffer from death because we'll just be a collective, and you won't even feel like someone dies because the collective will live on. And I just think, when I read that, I'm like, that's just like, I like Jameson. I thought that was stupid. Dystopia. Right, it's a dystopia, and for one thing, like even if the individual death is nothing, it's at least a metaphor for the heat death of the universe, right? Like, so eventually, even the collective dies, right? Like, sorry, right?
No, I would say that the issue is, again, I think that the agony of the last century is that it lived in the shadow of a failed attempt to overcome capitalism that then we resent as a kind of utopia. And also we look at the results of it and we're like, oh, it's dystopia, right? The East. And so it's not about overcoming suffering per se. It's about overcoming this specific form of suffering. So
Totally
we're free to move on to
Totally
the
agree.
next form of suffering.
Totally
Right?
agree.
Can we suffer in
Totally
a different way?
Totally agree.
Please,
Yeah.
than capitalism.
Yeah, totally
Right?
agree.
That's
Yeah.
the goal. The goal is
Totally
to
agree.
free ourselves to find new ways to suffer rather than being
Totally
stuck
agree.
in this way.
All right, one last commercial break here before we get back to it. I just have to make a quick plug for the course that is between Todd's course in July and Cutrone's course in October. And that is me teaching Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Infinity, and Mikey teaching Introduction to Slavoj Žižek. Slavoj Žižek needs no introduction, but a lot of people don't really know much about Levinas, and what they do know is probably informed by some cringe academics. But listen, we've got the tea. We will tell you what he's really good for, or at least I will. Look, Levinas is one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. He is the most important moral and ethical theorist of the 20th century. And he's one of the top 4 in all human history. At least if you talk to me and Mikey about it, it goes Aristotle, Mill, Kant, Levinas, right? Totality and Infinity is an expansion pack on being in time. It's a great introduction to phenomenology. It's a great way of thinking about the French post-structuralist critique of both Marxism as well as Nazism, as well as all forms of totalitarianism, as well as all totalitarian thinking. And the thing is I know that Chris Cutrone is going to say it's something that he probably disagrees with, but who knows? Cutrone is always surprising me. I can never really be sure what he's going to say next. And so it'll be very interesting to go through Totality and Infinity, and then Žižek, and then get to Introduction to Marxism, where Cutrone will be talking about Marxism, specifically like this political sense of Marxism, not the focus on the political economic, but the focus on political Marxism, which is exactly what this sort of Levinasianism is a critique of. And so it's going to be fascinating to watch that sort of potential contradiction emerge, right? Well, if you want to be a part of that, then the best way is to become a monthly member, subscriber at Theory Underground, where you will get 90% off of all the courses that I'm teaching and 50% off of all the courses that other people are teaching. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and we'll get right back to the program. Enjoy. Peace. I like to make the distinction here between suffering and misery, right? Just because it's like orders of, and that's arbitrary, but it's an order of magnitude thing. And I maybe I got that from Mikey, I'm not sure, but it's how we talk about it in our conversations, which is like, yeah, let's get to where we can all just share in the fact that we all suffer at bottom. But in order to do that, we'd have to make it so that some people don't have to be in misery, so that some of us live in this weird, there's like a numbness kind of misery where you're just in this sort of numbness and you're not living because everyone else in the world is working, so that you can just live in this weird bubble of comfort that is actually miserable. And then of course there's the misery of the
meaningless suffering, right?
The meaningless suffering of the slaves who make it so that you can be in that little bubble, right? And so it's like, yeah, I see that you're both going to be able to more or less agree when you're coming at this. Now Todd, I don't know if you'd say, maybe I missed it, but did you say the thing about non-identity being essential to your conception of the left?
Yeah, non-belonging, but certainly non-identity. Right? Like,
sorry,
I think
that's right.
I didn't develop the idea, but I think that Lacan's other great contribution is to see the difference between subjectivity and symbolic identity, right? And so he conceives of subjectivity as what can't be captured in your symbolic identity, right? And I think one of the things, and I think that's a really valuable thing for the left today, because I think that we're so enmeshed in this I am my identity. And I think for Lacan, he rightly sees that I am never my identity, right? Like that no matter what
It's a
kind of
narcissism
marker.
problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right.
It's a narcissism.
Yeah.
And the way that I understand the difference between Freud and Lacan is that they're facing a different problem. In other words, that for Freud, a kind of narcissistic problem is like a limit case for what he's trying to deal with at the level of the neurosis. Whereas I think that Lacan is living in an era where not just Lacan, but many followers of Freud are confronting a different kind of problem. And it is a kind of more pre-Oedipal narcissistic problem that capitalism has engendered. And that, where again, we're kind of tormented by an impossible desire, a kind of, this will make no sense, a narcissistic ego ideal, right? Where actually ego ideal should be the opposite of narcissism, and yet that does become our ego ideal. And I think it's very hard for us to relate to Freud. Like Freud seems to be part of a different world, whereas Lacan speaks to us more directly. And
Well,
all
I think,
that I, right? What
yeah,
I think is
that's
that
right,
should
Chris.
That
be
makes
naturalized.
Cutrone the first person in world history to say that Lacan says something directly. But great job, yeah.
No, but I think one way
Oh,
to
really?
say, Chris, what you're saying is one way to think of it is the different ways in which they conceive of the superego, right? Like, so for Freud, the superego is this massive force of prohibition that wants to stop us from doing what we want, and Lacan says there is nothing that commands us to enjoy other than the superego, right? Like it's just exactly the opposite, right? I mean, Lacan would say no, Freud already thought this, but really, and I think it's what you're saying, that like when you said this ego ideal that's narcissistic, like that's what Lacan means when he says there's the force of the superego is this imperative to enjoy. So or in other words, you could say like what we feel in Freud's era, what we feel guilty of is like, oh, I want to sleep with my parent, or I want to like kill the father, some kind of violate some prohibition. Whereas today, and in the Lacan's era, I think what you feel guilty for is your failure to enjoy, right? Like you're like, what? God, I missed that sale. What the hell? How did I miss that? Or like oh my God, I missed someone else got that last model of that thing that I wanted and I didn't get it, right? Like all those kind of like failure to, or someone else is with the incel, right? Like they're utterly,
oh my God,
they're utterly determined by this superegoic force that's saying someone else is enjoying more than you are, right? And I think it's unknown to Freud. Like it's just that kind of process is unthinkable for him. But in Lacan's universe, that makes perfect sense.
Adorno has a phrase that's great on this point, which is the pressure to be permitted to obey.
Yeah.
Right? That, it's almost like the only pleasure that we have in advanced capitalism is when we submit to the, to the dictate, to enjoy yourself. And, that also means, enjoyment, I think, in both senses. So I don't think, he wasn't doing the jouissance thing, but I think that he also thought that submitting to suffering, being given permission to submit to suffering, was also a satisfaction, right? It was a psychological satisfaction. It sort of gave some like ersatz meaning to existence.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I always think of with this idea, just quickly, because like that, I think of the Goebbels' speech on the total war speech, where he's like, you've worked 8 hours, now we're going to work 10 and 12, 14, and the crowd's just going crazy. Like they're going crazy at the fact that they're going to be sacrificing more, and so they're like, he's giving them permission to enjoy their obedience, right? Like I think that seems to me exactly in line with what Adorno is saying.
It's very peculiar.
Yeah.
It's very peculiar because, again, the positive function of the superego for Freud is, conscience. is serving a higher ideal, is like, that kind of early kind of exaggerated kind of idealization. Um, but again, that's a kind of a narcissistic pleasure, and that's not to stigmatize it, but to just say that it's a very kind of primitive pleasure, and that we have to be able to handle that. In other words, that we have to achieve a certain level of maturity where we're not simply in the thrall of that. Right. So, losing yourself, I teach Freud, and students always come at me with Lacanianism or pseudo-Lacanianism, actually. More like R.D. Langism or something, because they're like, well, what about ego death? And I'm like, children, please don't. Like, please don't desire ego death. Please don't. Like, that way lies madness. But they, because they're like, but okay, so Freud's telling us this, but what about the pleasure to be free from yourself, right? And I'm like, we should be, so here I will be a master of suspicion. We should be suspicious of that in capitalism because it tends to serve very authoritarian ends.
Yeah.
Right? Even just in the consumerist way that you were talking about, like even in the more benign way,
Yeah.
it's still pretty dark.
Yeah. Totally agree. Totally agree.
And, I'm not going to say that, look, Marxism succumb to that in the 20th century. In other words, a lot like the mass movements that most people associate with Marxism were as authoritarian as fascism, absolutely, and cannot be disentangled from that psychology. I just like to remember, actually, people like Marx and Engels and Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and Trotsky, they weren't down with that kind of authoritarianism. They actually wanted people to think for themselves. They actually kind of assumed that people could think for themselves. They assumed like workers could make political choices, right? That they weren't just doing it because there's a pleasure in obeying. That would have struck them as completely contrary to what they were trying to do politically.
Right.
Chris, is
You know,
psychoanalysis essential to your Marxism, to your approach to politics, to how you think about the situation, to how you think about a solution or a way forward? And if so, why?
I think that psychoanalysis, I mean, I would say my Frankfurt School approach to psychoanalysis is that psychoanalysis describes something real, something that's historically specific, and it paradoxically describes both something to be overcome and something to be attained. Right? So Marcuse has a wonderful essay called The Obsolescence of the Freudian Concept of Man. And he said, it's not only an image of a past to be recovered, the Freudian concept of the psyche, but also a future to be attained. Right? In other words, that socialism would be the achievement of the bourgeois subject and not merely the negation of it. Because, of course, capitalism has already negated the bourgeois subject. And so, in many respects, emancipation would look like the restoring of that subject, but also in order to be able to get beyond it, potentially. Right? So I think that a lot of like,
is that to say that you're taking this Marcuse line, then that if socialism were to achieve its victories or what have you, the human subject, it would become unsplit. There would be no more unconscious, no more repression, no more drive.
Not in the way that we experience it now. That would be the idea. In other words, the way we experience it now, because of course there's like repression, there's repression. In other words, there's, we have to learn to filter and to order the world, and and people have probably always been doing that. But this contradiction, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, between the conscious and the unconscious, it all depends on what we mean by contradiction. Right? If we're thinking about it as like productive, as like a productive tension that's constitutive, that's one thing. But if we're experiencing it as a split self, then that's another thing. Right? In other words, is our self in that contradiction, or is our self lost as a function of that contradiction? I just have in mind, like I said, French fries, schizo criticism, Deleuze and Guattari, right? And I'm like, no, like that's capitalism. Like capitalism is psychotic. That's not freedom, right? So that's my fear, is that, and it does do an injustice to Lacan, but I think that Lacan gets assimilated to other things that are more about like celebration of a non-subject, basically. And it's like, well, no, right? And so again, it has to do with how we understand the contradiction as constitutive, and also the contradiction as something that's actually disintegrative. And I think that in capitalism, it's something that the disintegrative aspect is more prominent than the constitutive aspect. That we have to sort of abandon the aspiration to be an ego in order to function in daily life in capitalism.
Perfect.
We
Okay.
have to sort of surrender ourselves to these processes.
I think that's the sensible answer, and it makes a lot of sense. But okay, now I'm being redundant. That's how late it is. So we'll be closing this thing out pretty shortly. But Todd, how about you? How essential is psychoanalysis to your politics, to your Marxism, to your conception of the situation, and how you see a way forward, and why?
Well, it's absolutely essential, and maybe for the reason Chris said. Although I would not. I mean, I think Deleuze and Lacan are about Deleuze, Guattari versus Lacan. I think they're about as opposed as can be. Like I think that I don't think there's any risk of this like celebration of the schizo in Lacan. Like I think that's not. But I do think that, like, to me, I guess to me that the something essential to my way of thinking about politics is the term we haven't talked about today, is the idea of and this is Freud's great discovery in 1920. I think that the unconscious. I like what Chris said about the productive versus the destructive. I think that's good, and I or the productive versus the dissipating. I agree with that. But I would just say that I think that this idea that Freud comes up with in 1920 of the death drive is really just absolutely crucial to the way I think about politics, and that is, how do we think about our own self-destructiveness and the self-destructiveness of the society, and integrate that into our thinking about politics. And I don't think that, and I think one of the differences probably between us on a lot of these questions is this, like, you want to say, I think that these are historically determined ideas, and I almost never want to say that. So that's
or at least conditioned.
Conditioned, right.
Determined, conditioned.
Right. Yeah, I almost never want to say that. Because I think that, and this comes back to a statement you made. You quoted Grundrisse, which is it's one of Marx's most Hegelian moments, where he says, but then I thought you added a little twist to it that I'm not sure I agree with. So what Marx says is that anatomy of the human holds the key to the anatomy of the ape, right? But what is that? That doesn't mean that the ape causes the human. It means that in a certain sense, the human causes the ape. And I think
that's right.
I think this is where Marx isn't Hegelian, or let's say Freudian enough. That Hegel's, I think, his entire philosophy, and I think this idea of death drive is all about this, is about a philosophy of Nachträglichkeit, of retroactivity. Like, so when you say like, yeah, the past was totally different, I think Hegel's right on board with you. Like, he's like, yeah, like I'm recounting the history of the present, right? Like, I'm not recounting history as a movement from the past to the future. I'm recounting the history of the present, right? And so I feel like that, to me, is just utterly central to my way of conceiving of politics. And it makes me think that the real political change is, and I think Trump kind of gets this really. Like Trump really understands this better than the left, that you change the past, you don't change the future, you change the past, and then that changes the where we're going, right? Like you give us a different past. I think that's what Hegel's doing in his philosophy, saying like this is the history of the present, and if we understand history in this way, then we're headed down this one path. But if we don't understand history in this way, then we're headed down this disastrous path, right? So I feel, and that's why he says history is the history of freedom, not because it's really the history of freedom, but because Hegel, in a political act, says we can see the history of freedom in this what's happened, right? And that's a political act on Hegel's part.
Yes.
And so that's where
it's about the freedom of the present. So the freedom of the present unlocks the freedom of the past.
Yes.
And then would you both agree that that's also the next level kind of way of reading the history? You know, the history is a history of class war, class struggle.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, Marx himself would have said it's not evident. It wasn't evident to the Greeks that history was the history of class struggle. It's only evident now, and that's why this great invention of Marx. It's an invention, right? Of class struggle.
Yes.
He rewrites the past in order to make this thing evident that was only, I mean, in Hegelian jargon, it was there in itself, right? But then Marx makes it for itself, right? Like, and that, I think it's like that.
Right.
Like that, when Chris says like the Communist Manifesto awakened him from his dogmatic slumber, that idea is really the key idea of that text, right? That history is the history. I mean, it's the opening line, but it's the key line, right? Like history is history of class struggle, because
and it's also an exhortation.
Yeah,
exhortation. We have to make it so.
Yeah.
Right. And so so having like, how did it become the case? What was the possibility of the present in the past? Which wasn't necessarily determinately so, but made the present possible. What was the potential in the past that allowed this to happen? And to grasp that, because that's how we grasp possibility in the present, right? So on the non-identity and non-belonging, I want to say something about that. Because I think that speaks to the psychology aspect of it. In other words, the desire to belong, and the desire to become identical. Self-identity as an aspiration. I mean, this is where I do think that Hegel's important, in the sense that, and again, not understood at a personal level, just at an individual psychological level, but that the attainment of self-identity is also the attainment of non-identity. That, in other words, once self-identity is achieved, then it yields a new contradiction, right? Meaning it actually, it's not like we have this heterogeneity difference, and then, pardon me, it becomes identical, and then that's it. It's more like, no, actually, and this is getting back to the point about Adorno that you mentioned earlier. It's about difference not simply existing, but as the result. In other words, the possibility of becoming different. So I always, I use this example in terms of being gay and why I hate the gay gene. It's like, I'm not demanding the freedom to be gay. I'm demanding the freedom also, to one day not be gay. Like, in other words, like, let me be different from myself also. Let me become different from myself. And of course, that only works as a rough analogy, because what we're really talking about is the society that we're in. Can the society become other than itself? Can it become something different? It's not about trying to fit the square peg into the round hole. It's not about trying to take things that just are different and make them the same. It's about, okay, we are this thing, capitalism, and it's differentiated, it's heterogeneous, but can we become something different from what we are now as a society? Right. So that kind of notion of contradiction. The contradiction is the possibility of difference that doesn't exist yet. Right. So non-identity, not as like Because I think that the thing with belonging is that I fear that people will hear it as, something's always left out. Something's always left out of the equation. And it's like, well, actually, maybe what we want is the possibility of people who fit in now not fitting in, right? So in other words, it's not about who doesn't fit in now exactly, but it's also about the possibility of a future difference being produced. Diverse multiplicity, that's the phrase from Adorno. That freedom is, the image of freedom is an image of diverse multiplicity rather than heterogeneity, right? So not originating in difference. Maybe we do originate in sameness, but the possibility of becoming different.
Well,
from what we
guys,
are now. Non-identity as a
I hate to do this because I, at this point, have a list of questions that is very long that I would like to actually get into, at least a couple of them. There's a couple ones that I think might really get us into some weeds, though, or open some cans of worms, and might be very, very exciting. But I also have a responsibility here to kind of stick to the schedule. You guys being the headliners means that we got to go over, and we had to go over because things started a bit late and everything. But I know it's very
Sorry about
late.
that, yes.
I know it's very late. Hey, Chris, that you can't control that. And so, I know it's very late where you're at. And I really appreciate you both for being here. And I would love to resume this in June once the tour is over. Once we had some time to think about it and come back. I really look forward to seeing some productive conversations follow from this. I've seen in the comment sections before people who are really into Lacan or really, really into Marx but hate Lacan just get ridiculous in the comment sections, and you both have your own little fandoms. And so I want you guys, okay, and that's not the right way to say that, but I want you guys to set a good example on the way out here. Maybe say a word to your audiences about your thoughts about this conversation. And I honestly, I just couldn't be more delighted. I really, really appreciate you both. Like I said, you guys are driving this thing without me. I wasn't needed. I could have eaten dinner actually, but no, really, really thank you from the bottom of my heart. I'll give you each a opportunity here just to say your closing thoughts, and then we'll close it out.
I'll start. Yeah, Chris, it was great talking to you. It was well worth the wait, and I thought it was perfect. Like I really liked the points of conjunction and also the points of distinction. I couldn't have been better. So I really appreciated that. And I hope that I don't have any fans, so I'm not going to speak to them.
No, I mean it's tricky, right? So it's a polarized world. I hate that kind of polarization because I think that people think that that maybe they're looking for people to prohibit. Maybe they're looking for them to ban, to put a ban,
Yeah.
And it's a funny thing because on the one hand, I feel like I'm desperately trying to, maintain the worthwhile character of Marxism as something to investigate. But then when I see that people get very kind of narrowly centered on or focused on Marxism, I'm like, read some non-Marxism. I think that Dave, you posted something about eclecticism, right? And you're just like, but Marx was an eclectic. And I was like, well, I feel like, okay, Dave, are you complaining about me? Right? Are you saying that I'm like anti-eclecticism or something? And
No,
it's
no,
like,
no.
I actually think that no, but I took it a little bit to heart there. And
No,
I was like,
wait, hold
no,
on. Was that
like,
your tweet? Was that your tweet? Was
your
it your
tweet
tweet?
was
No.
about eclecticism.
No, I retweeted Doug Lane, who was saying he was saying something about eclecticism. He was saying like people who think they have to read something outside of Marx. He said there's a word for that. It's eclecticism, and it's a way of not reading Marx.
And you were responding to that.
I retweeted
Right.
it, and I said, like, this was just a few days ago, actually. That's why I remember. But I retweeted it and said that I said there's a difference between eclecticism and reading widely to understand the situation, and the difference is if you have a method and an aim, and it's you're refining how you do it or something like that. I'm sure it wasn't that articulate, but
No, it was.
Yeah,
It was actually pretty pithy. I thought that it made a point.
okay. Yeah, I'm just saying, like, I don't think
So
he's
I would never
eclectic in the
say-
sense of just kind of patching things together. No.
No, right. There's a project. But so then I would say, okay, I guess academically, but also maybe in the public world, my kind of caveat about Lacan, because this was true of me too. So I had read Interpretation of Dreams in high school. I thought it was kind of interesting, but mind was not blown, let's put it that way. And then I read some Lacan in college because I was doing like cinema and media studies, and so we read some Lacan. And so what I tell kids now is, you know what, Lacan is like a little bit meta. You got to start with Freud, because you need to know what Lacan is talking about first. Like, in other words, you can't start with Lacan and then read Freud, because it's going to kind of disorient you. And so it's best to start with Freud and then see what Lacan adds, right? See what he's bringing out. And also think about that. Think about the difference as well. And also think about the difference historically. So I would never say, oh, be a Marxist, not a Lacanian, because I'm not even sure what people understand by being a Marxist. If it doesn't mean being critical, right? So it's like, I mean, we experience this in academia, right? That kids think that there's like a toolbox, there's like methods, and you got your Lacanian screwdriver here, and you got your Marxist wrench over here, right? And it's like, it doesn't work that way, children. No. It's like, if the screwdriver isn't telling you, like, what the hell is a screwdriver, right? If you just think you can just use it, no, that's the wrong way to start out. So the factionalism of intellectual life, I mean, it's like everything else in the society now. Things are very polarized. People do feel the need to find someone or something to hate, to counter-identify with. That's really unfortunate. I wish that there was more like breathing room, more room for thinking, considering, more room. Also, I don't know if you've noticed this, Todd, young people are very anxious. They don't have much tolerance for being confused.
Yeah.
And it's like,
yeah, totally
that's
agree.
the only way you learn. The only way you learn is to be confused for a while.
Right.
And just have the patience for that, but it seems very hard. It seems like that's not really available.
Yeah, I mean, I think
wouldn't
we
want
live in a world today, and I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So I wouldn't want to polarize, like, in other words, the differences that we've articulated shouldn't be polarized. It should be, have you considered this? Have you considered that? It should be, I'm interested, the only interest that I have in Marxism is in the problems and questions that it opens up. Not, if it's used by people to shut things down, that's the opposite of what I think is worthwhile about it.
Thank you so much, guys.
Okay,
It
thanks.
was really
David.
a pleasure.
Great to talk to you, Chris. Yeah.
Me too. Definitely.
Take care.
Thanks.
Yeah. Bye.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Welcome to Theory Underground, a place for workers with earbuds who are tired of the bullshit and just want to get down to it. Big ideas, rigorous thinking, and ultimately liberation from necessity.
Research at Theory Underground focuses on what is most important for understanding our current situation: theory of the subject, capital, time-energy theory, critical media theory, CMT, and the most essential critiques necessary for understanding why the theory, ideology, and common sense of influencers left to right misses the mark.
Theory Underground is coming to a city near you. Besides a commitment to publishing certain underground theorists and popularizing certain fundamental concepts, we have toured the United States and are touring Europe to promote our ideas, courses, and publications. You've been reading Underground Theory.
Amazing book. I'm a publisher and an editor. I run a review of books. Literally, it's my living. This is the best edited collection I've ever read.
Okay, picture the scene. America, early 2021. An Amazon warehouse worker arises from the emerging underground theory internet scene to create spaces for untimely topics and concerns that are too often neglected or kept in isolation today. Joined by a revolving cast of underground theorists, academics, and critics, he establishes what will become Theory Underground, a teaching, research, and publishing platform by and for working-class intellectuals, autodidacts, and academics who want to do more than they're able to do within the confines of academia. That warehouse worker's name is David McKerracher, and his book Timenergy is his first major contribution to the world of theory. It was recently reprinted with a foreword by none other than Slavoj Žižek, who also contributed to Theory Underground's latest book.
My Bible, it's an excellent book.
A collection of essays called Underground Theory.
What you just heard is an excerpt from the Strange Exiles podcast, episode 23, where Bram from Strange Exiles interviewed me and Mikey. For those who don't know, Mikey is the author of the Dangerous Maybe blog. We are publishing one of his books here shortly at Theory Underground. He's also a lecturer at Theory Underground, and he's someone I've been friends and a collaborator with for over 10 years. But most importantly for you all, he's a fantastic lecturer, and it's a crime that he has to do wage labor right now. One of the long-term goals of Theory Underground has been now for a couple of years to hashtag free Mikey. That is something that I've been really pushing, but first, obviously, I have to get freed myself, so the two of us are able to do this because, as Mikey said, build it and they will come. Well, I tried and I built a website and platform. I had my own app and everything, but it's been really buggy and it's more than one person can handle, and that's, a really good lesson for me. And so for now, what we're doing is moving it to a temporary intermediary platform until we are able to get some more serious funding. And ultimately, we want to be in a place like this, a real brick and mortar digital nomadic mecca where people can come from all over the world. But also, the app was really expensive, and so by quitting it, I am now able to save a lot of money, and with the help of my patrons and the students at Theory Underground, especially the monthly subscribers, I am officially able to quit Amazon and do Theory Underground full time. So thank you so much, everybody. This is one huge step forward. With that said, several subscribers did not migrate from the now defunct app to the new setup, and I'm guaranteed to lose people over time. So please, if you want to get involved, become a subscriber. If you're not even sure what this is all about but are just curious, then I've added Tier 0 and Tier 1 for very basic kinds of access to what we are doing behind the scenes. If you don't have any time or energy to get involved, but you do have some money to help support this project from afar, then please check out the Patreon. My patrons over at Patreon make the podcast and public YouTube possible. Thank you. As for once-in-a-lifetime events, check out the new poster for the American Idiots Theory Underground European Book Tour. Paris, Brussels, Berlin, Vienna, Linz, Krakow, Glasgow, London, and Oxford from April 27th to May 25th, 2024. 2 events are already fully booked out. Save a seat at an event by getting in contact with us ASAP. Finally, the call for proposals to our conference in Mexico.
What's up, everybody? TUCon 2024 update here. It's not happening in Mexico anymore, but it is still happening on October 24th through the 27th.
The change was made because a lot of the people that wanted to attend and that were expected to attend said they could probably afford to travel if they had more time advance notice. So save up for June 2025.
If you have to choose, right? Because this one that is happening this year is happening physically in Boise, Idaho, because we have a lot of collaborators and fellow travelers and co-instructors there. but you can attend virtually for this one. You won't be able to attend virtually next year. So yeah, if you have to attend physically in 2025. The call for proposals already happened. The writing workshop for proposals already happened. You can still get the links to both of those. Just shoot us a message and ask for those links. We'll get you those. And the form goes live on June 1st, and the deadline is June 15th. So if you're attending physically, let me know ASAP.
Get in on it.
All right. Finally, last little thing here is to say thank you so much to my patrons over at Patreon. The Patreon is for people who are too busy to be students or subscribers at Theory Underground, but who want to see more of this free content on the podcast and YouTube channel for Theory Underground. You are the ones who see something of value in the free content being made available here, and you want to see more of it. Your patron pledges at Patreon are a real motivator for me, so thank you so much. Especially thanks to Marilyn Lawrence, Bert Vanderkar, Carl Vanderlip, Nikolai, Sahil Kumar, Zuxandra, Darian Large, Tyler Murphy, Max Mackin, Al, Algeri, Ben Rosenbluth, Atlantic Airlines, Lewis, Matt Payne, Neil C., Simon Condon, Yiz, and Schwabkinson. Thank you.